This lecture will focus on the struggle and fight that Texas had for independence from Mexico. The first Americans to come to Texas were not coming into just some wild place with nobody living there at all. There were settlements already set up by the Spanish speaking people, by the Tejanos, is how you would say it. But as soon as it was opened up, there was a man named Moses Austin, and his dream was to bring families down and settle this area. And on his deathbed, he asked his son, who was studying to be a lawyer, he said, please realize my dream and bring these Americans to Texas. And so as he died, Stephen F. Austin took over that dream of his father's and was going to hold it out or make it happen, okay? And so him and what was known as the 300 American families came down to settle. He had very strict rules on who could go down there. They were not allowed to drink, no criminal history. They had to be good people. They had to have families, just all of these different things to make like this perfect settlement. And so he brought them down in, and he's kind of seen as one of the first Americans to really start pulling in Americans to this Texas that was owned by the Spanish and then Mexico. All right. And so Texas, what was it like when he got there? What was it like in the beginning? In the north, the territory was controlled by the Apache, Comanche, a couple other tribes, so they had their own societies set up in the northern part of Texas. In the southern part of Texas, there were settlements, cities, towns that were established by these Tejanos, these Spanish-speaking people who were living there, who were Mexican or Spanish or Mestizo or any of these different things. Okay, and then in 1824, they had actually joined up and become part of the Mexican state of Coahuila. And so, they weren't just this wilderness, but they still really struggled to get their people to go and live on the frontier because you're away from big cities, you're away from other people. Okay, it could be dangerous with the natives in the area, potentially fighting you back for their land, and so they had a hard time convincing people to go there. And so they made a group of colonization laws. And these colonization laws essentially gave cheap land to anyone who was willing to come in and live there and civilize this place. And so a couple of the laws that were involved in there were for 10 years you would be exempt from paying taxes into Mexico. So the first 10 years that you were living there, you would not have to pay any taxes at all. And then as you came in, the only rule was you had to become a Mexican citizen and follow their government, and also a Roman Catholic and follow their religion. So that was kind of the trade that they set up to become or to live in this area. So the way the Mexicans set this up as they were, a brand new country, like we talked about before, is they set up impresarios. So an impresario is just a person that they gave a large grant of Texas land to. So they gave them this big piece of land, and they agreed they would fill it with settlers. Impresario is just a Spanish word. It means agent. So they're kind of like agents of the government trying to bring people in. And Stephen F. Austin was one of these people, and he, over time, brought in about 1,500 American families. And so he was a very successful impresario as well. Now, the Americans that came in, there were some problems, and the Mexican government had these problems with them because generally they came in and they didn't accept the language or the customs of Mexico. And so they just didn't live like the Mexicans did. And that made a lot of people a little bit concerned and distrustful of them. They also did not accept Roman Catholicism because many of them were Lutheran and they didn't want to, or Protestant of some sort, and they didn't want to accept a religion that they didn't believe. And so, because of all this, because of their unwillingness to become like the Mexicans, which they were supposed to do. That was the agreement that they had. The Tejanos, the people that were already living there, the Mexicans, did not trust them very much. And as they were kind of looking at it, they said, these Americans have taken over the entire eastern side of Texas, and they're living a completely different life than the rest of Mexico. And we're worried that this might turn into something bad, which eventually it would. Benjamin Edwards was kind of the first domino to fall, I guess. In 1826, he was the brother of an impresario and he rebelled against Mexico. He called for any American settlements to come together and fight, and he said that they were all actually a free country altogether, the American settlements called Fredonia. And so this Fredonia Revolution, happened. Now, generally, this rebellion failed. Most of the settlers ignored him, and as soon as the military showed up, the Mexican military showed up, he dispersed and left. But even though the rebellion failed, Mexico's government started to think about it, and they were really worried that it showed the beginnings of an American plan to take Texas from Mexico. So since Mexico was worried about this, they reacted, and in 1830 they closed their borders to immigration from anywhere. And so what happened is, these families and their friends and everything from America were not able to come in and live in the Texas area. So the borders were completely closed to immigration. It was not legal to do that anymore. The other thing they said is anybody who brings in slaves, that is against the law now. It's banned to import the slaves, and the Americans of Texas wanted slavery, but Mexico had already said no slavery. When they created their government, they had gotten rid of slavery. And then the other thing that Mexico did is they taxed goods. So they put tariffs down and taxed goods from foreign countries. So these Texans, again, that were used to getting their goods and buying them from Americans, now would have to pay a much higher price because of the tariffs that were in place. And so the Americans were angry about all of these different things. And so they had these feelings. And what they realized was their territories can't grow. If we can't bring in more people and your people aren't willing to come and live here, then we can't grow and we can't get bigger. And the other thing, of course, they had to pay more because of those tariffs for the goods that they had always bought from America anyways. And last but not least, it was just that Mexico's making rules for them, and they didn't like that. Even though it was their government, they didn't feel like they were connected to it. They didn't feel like it was their government. So that was, kind of the reaction of the Americans, how they felt about Mexico's actions after this Fredonia rebellion. Take a moment to write out the answer to this question. So the attempts at peaceful negotiations did happen, and the Americans tried to fix this. The Texans, I guess, people that were from America originally. These Texan settlers met at conventions because everyone was getting angry and they wanted to try and talk it out before they fought it out in San Felipe in 1832 and 1833. And Stephen Austin was chosen as the president of this convention. We've already heard his name many times, and he was sent to negotiate with the government of Mexico. And so he went and talked to the government of Mexico. He asked for some changes, and really it was the convention asking. He was just the person who was going to negotiate. And they wanted to reopen Texas to American immigrants so more could come in and they could continue to grow. They wanted to lower taxes on the imports, again, reverse some of these things that Mexico had just done. They also wanted Texas to be allowed to become its own state instead of being part of another Mexican state. Still part of Mexico, but their own state, and allow Texas to use their own constitution that they also created and agreed on in these conventions. And so in 1833, negotiations kind of slowed down, and Austin wasn't able to figure it out. He wasn't able to get them to agree to anything. And so he sent a letter back home suggesting that the Texas settlers start their own state government and start to build it up. And soon after, he visited the Mexican president, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And when he went and talked to him, he found that Santa Anna was kind of receptive and met some of the demands that these Texas settlers had. And so that was great. But then he started to head home, and Santa Anna heard about the letter that had been sent and thought, you know what, he was trying to start a rebellion. Austin was trying to start a rebellion. And so he had him arrested without a trial and put into jail in Mexico City. Soon after this happened, Santa Anna declared himself as the dictator of Mexico. Again, Mexico was having some political problems at this time. And so Santa Anna declared himself the dictator of Mexico. That's this man right here. Austin was released from prison and started to head back home. And at this point, knowing or feeling that no matter what, they weren't going to get their demands met, Texas started to build their own army of settlers. All right, so Texas started to move towards declaring their independence here. And as this is happening, Texas is building an army, and the Mexican army has to step in and stop it. And so there were some big problems in the Mexican army because there wasn't much stability in the politics in the government of Mexico. And so the army just had really poor leadership. They didn't have people that were really experienced and did well. They had really poor training. They were not very good soldiers, and they had just kind of a lack of support, whether it's financial support. People didn't like them. There were all of these problems in the Mexican army. And so under this, kind of not so good army, we're seeing in Gonzales, the Texans take on their first victory. And so they went to Gonzales, which is about 70 miles away from San Antonio, Texas. And the Mexican troops marched up as they were told to and ordered the Texans to surrender their cannons and their weapons. The Texans refused. They said no. And because the Mexican troops did not have any orders to actually attack and take these weapons with force, they left and they went back to San Antonio. Then the Texans followed them and sieged the city, so tried to take over the city, and about 300 to 400 Texans drove the Mexican army, thousands of men, out of the city and showed their very first big victory. And so on March 2nd, 1836, on the heels of this victory, Texas declared their independence from Mexico. And soon thereafter, they wrote up a constitution that was very, very similar to the American Constitution, except that it explicitly protected slavery. So the Texas troops got a new commander, Sam Houston, who had some military experience, took command of the Texas troops, but he still needed to train them and get all of the volunteers that he possibly could and get new troops and all that kind of stuff. And so while this is happening, Santa Anna put together several thousand troops to put down the rebellion and started marching into Texas. They ended up meeting a group of Texans in the Alamo. And the Alamo is just an old abandoned Catholic mission. This is a picture of the Alamo. And so with only about 180 Texas rebels inside. So we have thousands of troops against 180 Texas rebels. With the leader, William B. Travis, who was in command of the Alamo at this time. And his goal, he knew the goal was to slow down Santa Anna as much as possible because Sam Houston needed time to get his troops and get them trained, and then they would be able to fight against this massive Mexican army. Travis realized they were running out of food. They were really struggling as they were surrounded by the Mexican troops. And he asked for reinforcements, but none ever did come to the Alamo to help out. And so these 180 Texas rebels were stuck on their own, but they were able to hold off Santa Anna's army for 13 days because Santa Anna's army sieged the place, so they stayed outside and made sure there wasn't any supplies going in or out. And then on March 6th of 1836, the Mexican army stormed. They attacked. They finally attacked the Alamo. And the Alamo defenders were able to fight them off for many hours before they were ended up being completely overrun. But this was huge. This was very, very important to Texas, even though they lost this battle because they had bought Sam Houston 2 weeks to get more troops and to prepare those troops and train them and all that kind of stuff. Now, the really crazy thing and the sad thing is that all of the defenders of the Alamo died because even the ones that surrendered to the Mexican army were executed. So they were killed, which again adds another layer to this war where Mexico, as they're ending these battles, are executing the prisoners. Take a moment to write out the answer to this checkpoint question. Goliad was another big defeat for the Texan army. The Mexican army came in and quickly overwhelmed a small group of troops in Goliad, about 300 men, and the Texans, almost all of them, surrendered. The Mexican commander didn't want to execute them, didn't want to kill them, but Santa Anna, right, the president, the dictator at this point, demanded that they were executed. And so on March 27th, 1836, a firing squad executed over 300 Texan volunteers. And so, why is this important? Why is this great for Texas? So, it's obviously a really bad thing. It was seen as a massacre more than a battle because they just killed all of these defenseless people. But these losses at Alamo and at Goliad were terrible, but they united the fighters in support of this new country. So they saw almost the Mexicans became the villain because they were going to kill you no matter what. So if you surrendered, they were going to kill you. If you gave up, or if you fought to the death, you were going to die. And so that gives people incentive to fight to the death, as well as to remember their friends who had died fighting or not fighting against the Mexican troops. Even with the time that was bought by these other battles, Sam Houston realized he still needed more time to recruit more volunteers, to train more soldiers, just to make his army a little more polished before he squared off straight up in an even match against the Mexican army because it was so much larger. And so what he started to do was a controlled retreat. And so he started to move away from the Mexican army and continue to move away, and continue to train and get more people in his army. And so he was retreating just to buy more time, to do whatever he could. And what he decided to do was to continue retreating. And since he was down in numbers, he decided to wait for Santa Anna to make a mistake. This mistake happened at the Battle of San Jacinto. The San Jacinto River, which is close to Houston, Texas, both armies were camped on the San Jacinto River. And so they were very close to each other. And because they were running away, Santa Anna thought, these guys are no threat. They're not going to attack us. They're scared. They're running no matter what. We're going to eventually catch them and shut this whole thing down or kick them out into America, and they won't be able to come back. And so Santa Anna said, they're not going to attack us. We're good. So you guys can all take a nap in the afternoon. And so he let his men sleep in the afternoon. The Texans decided that, okay, this is the time to attack. And they were able to convince Sam Houston of that. And so they snuck up as close as they could under the cover of a hill. And as they popped over the hill, they were already super close to the sleeping Mexican army, and they started yelling, "Remember Goliad, remember the Alamo," as they attacked, and that was their battle cry, because you're supposed to remember that all your friends died and these people were so brutal, but also that if you don't fight and kill them, they are going to kill you, even if you surrender. And so hundreds of Mexicans were killed, about 700 Mexicans were taken as prisoner, and during this entire battle, Texas only had 9 men killed on their side and 34 men injured. But the really important part about this battle was not just how decisive and how much they had beaten them by, but that Santa Anna was one of the Mexicans that was captured. And so now he was in control, or the Americans were in control of the dictator of the country. And so Santa Anna was forced to order the army away and to recognize Texas independence. Now, Mexico wouldn't recognize Texas independence, but this man at gunpoint was forced to do that. So like I said, the Mexican government refused the treaty. They said, no, you're not your own independent nation. But they didn't send any more troops and fight, so it was kind of an implicit, we're saying, we're not saying you're independent, but we're kind of going to act like you're independent. We're not going to fight you anymore over it. And so the Republic of Texas was formed. They elected Sam Houston, that general, as their president. And as soon as they became their own republic, they voted in favor of annexation. Annexation is when you just become another part of a country. So an annex, it might be one larger country taking over a smaller country or a smaller area to become part of their country. Usually not by force, right? They're choosing to be in there. So They voted to become part of the United States, and most people believed that the Americans wanted to do this. But really, what was happening is people in the South definitely wanted it, and really, people in the North would have been okay with getting more land. They liked that idea, but the problem is they were a slave state, right? They would have been a big territory of slaveholders, and so that would have kind of tipped the balance in slavery's favor of this free state, slave state argument that has been happening in Congress already for a while. And Andrew Jackson, as the president, really didn't want any more problems between the North and the South. They didn't want to risk war with Mexico, just didn't want any of the fighting. So he decided not to try to annex Texas, even though Texas was asking America to. And so he just kind of stepped away from the situation. And on his last day, he did, however, recognize that Texas was an independent republic. So Texas would continue on as an independent republic until they could find somebody to annex them, one of the presidents who would push it through. Take a moment to write out 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any questions, then you can just create 3 test questions you might see on the quiz or a test for this material.